Welcome to Hiraeth, a home for the left in Wales. You join us here this evening with Dr. Ed Bridges. He's the campaigner who took South Wales Police to court for their illegal use of facial recognition software, the first legal action of its kind in the world. Hello, Ed.
Hello, Shemai.
Shemai, diolch am ddod a sioe. Thank you for coming. We're here tonight with me, you and Kerry, and we're going to talk about your recent case against South Wales Police. But first, before we talk about that, what is facial recognition software and what are the problems with it?
So facial recognition technology, it is technology that will capture the images of people who walk past a camera at a particular position, but rather than simply recording them in the way that traditional CCTV might, it does a biometric scan of someone's face. It basically maps what your face looks like. So it will, in a matter of milliseconds, measure, the distances between different facial features. And it will then compare that to, in this case, a police watch list, and will look for matches. And one of the really important things to understand about the way that the police use this technology, and one of the things that was really clear in the Court of Appeal judgment that we had, is that this is very different from traditional CCTV images because of the way that you have that biometric scan of your face and the processing of your personal data. So if you're like me and you go and watch a lot of football matches, I go and watch Newport County more than is enjoyable, and I'm well used to having police forces pointing a CCTV camera at a crowd of football fans that I might be in, or a crowd of protesters you might be part of, or whatever it happens to be. Normally what happens is that a crowd is filmed and the footage of that is kept for a set number of days, and under data protection legislation, you have the right to request that footage. Now, not many people do, but if you're a nerd about these things like me, then you can, should you want to, write to the police force that has filmed the crowd you're in and say, I noticed that you were filming the crowd at Newport County against Exeter. I was part of that crowd. I would like to see any footage that you hold of me. Here's a passport size photo of me so you know what I look like. Here is £10, which you're allowed to charge as an admin fee. Please send me the footage. And if you wait a set number of days, you'll get a little CD that will you can put in your computer, and you can see what images the police have of you. So that sort of works from a data protection point of view, because you have rights over the data that's held, and you can request it, and it's relatively transparent, even if most people don't take up their rights under that legislation. Where facial recognition is different is that in a matter of seconds, your image is captured, it is processed, and that's a really key legal term. It's the same as, you giving your email address to someone, and under GDPR, if they use it, then they're processing your data, and it's checked against a watch list. And this is not like having a photograph taken of you. This is like giving a digital fingerprint, because it's uniquely identifiable data. It's something that is unique to you. And that is where the kind of ethical implications come in, and why we brought this case, because in a matter of seconds you've given away unique personal identifiable data to a third party, in this case the state, and they have processed that data, and you don't have any recourse to say, why were you using this way, how have you used it, what have you retained? So I probably talked too long, but that's in a nutshell what this is, and why it's ethically very interesting ground. And I should say right at the start as well, just before I stop talking, I'm not a data scientist, I'm not a lawyer. I come at this purely as an interested and concerned citizen. So I dare say there will be people listening who know a lot more about the technology than me and know more about the law than me, and that's fine, and I will listen to those people, as I have throughout this case. But I come at it purely as someone who is concerned about the way that the state is handling and processing the data of innocent citizens.
Were there any incidents in particular that made you want to take this action against South Wales Police then, or was it just the principle?
Like you guys, I suspect, living in Cardiff, when we had the Champions League final in summer 2017, I saw in South Wales Echo that South Wales Police were using this technology, and I thought, that's interesting. There's not been any consultation or public conversation about this, but it was presumably part of the deal for Cardiff getting that fixture. I sort of didn't really think more of it at the time. The first time that I would have had my data captured by this was in the run-up to Christmas 2017. Christmas 2017. I popped out my office to go and buy a sandwich and look for some Christmas presents, and I would have had my data captured as I walked up Queen Street, where there was a police van. And it was only really by the time you were close enough to see automatic facial recognition technology on it, you would already have had your data captured many times over. And, as I say, I'm a law-abiding citizen. I kind of mind my own business, and I don't really understand why the police were on my local high street taking my image. But again, I at that point, I didn't really do anything about it because, apart from grumbling on Twitter, which I wanted to do, it wasn't something that particularly bothered me. But the moment at which my hackles were raised with it was in March 2018, when there was a peaceful protest at the CIA against an arms fair that was happening. And on that occasion, South Wales Police parked their facial recognition van across the street from a crowd of protesters. Peaceful protesters. It was a very benign protest. I was stood with a load of Quakers and, Cymdeithas y Cymod and, very, very kind of genteel folk. And I think we all felt that it was the police, by parking their van and taking our data, they were trying to discourage us from using our right to protest. And I feel very strongly that the police should be supporting peaceful protest and not undermining it. And, particularly an arms fair. As it happened, I'd written to Alan Michael, the commissioner, before that protest to say, I'm sure your policing will be focusing on the protesters, but have you thought about the illegal arms trade that may be happening within the CIA? And, that should be of greater worry to the world than, a few lefties standing outside and holding up banners, So it was after that protest and the use of facial recognition technology that I got in touch with Liberty, and because they'd been doing stuff about the Met's use of facial recognition, and I said, look, this is what's happening in South Wales. Are you aware of it? And is this of help to your campaign? And things sort of snowballed from there until eventually, when they were looking to bring a test case, I guess because South Wales Police had used it against peaceful protesters, which I don't think at that point the Met had, it meant there was a particularly interesting additional dimension in terms of the kind of human rights implications.
The arms fair in Cardiff, one of our finer moments. So what would you say then to the argument that the use of this technology as it develops is there to kind of keep us safe in a wider context?
Well, there's several answers to that. Firstly, I don't doubt for a moment that the police have a difficult job to do. They, like every other public service, have had their budget slashed, and they need to look at whatever technologies and resources they can to do their job more effectively, and that's entirely reasonable. And I also understand the difficulties that they have when they've got a big event like the Champions League. They need to have the ability to spot the one person in a crowd of 100,000 who might be a problem. All of that is true, and all of that is a good argument for the use of facial recognition technology. But there's kind of several key issues I have with that. Firstly is just a relatively prosaic one, but actually if you look at the way South Wales Police have been using this technology, it has not been using a watch list of known terrorist suspects around big events. It's been to look for people who are wanted on warrant for relatively low level offences, and this was quite an interesting element of the hearing, that its kind of day-to-day operational use is not actually for the sorts of things that probably the public would imagine it would be for. The other argument is a much more kind of principled one, that we live in a democracy. We don't live in a dictatorship. We have policing by consent in this country, and so it's important that the police use technology in a way that the public can have confidence in. That's just as important to the police as it is to the public, because if the public lose confidence and trust in the police, then that is a much bigger societal problem. And so imposing the use of this technology without a formal public consultation, it was brought in under the guise of being a trial, but actually when the police were asked in the original hearing, what's the end point for this trial? What are the success and failure criteria of this trial? They didn't have an answer for that. In reality, this has just been rolled out as a kind of ongoing operational use. And, the concerns that civil liberties campaigners have had about the potentially discriminatory use of this technology, the way that it's been done in ways that perhaps don't respect things like privacy impact assessments and so on, that has all been ignored. And I think had South Wales Police and others engaged at an earlier stage with some of the civil liberties concerns, I think they could have perhaps made life a lot easier on themselves, because there are some who want this technology banned completely. I veer between that and a slightly more nuanced position. But the point is that the police have just tried to push this out and roll it out on an operational basis without really engaging in the civil liberties concerns. And I do think in a democratic society, that is something that should worry us. We're not in China, we're not in Russia. And if you look at the ways that some of those more authoritarian regimes have used this technology, clearly, if its use is not restricted in certain ways, then that is a problem for a free society.
What was your experience taking on an institution the size of South Wales Police?
Yeah, I mean, it's not something that I woke up one morning and thought I really want to take my local police force to court. And, I'm aware that next time my house gets broken into, I'm probably not going to get the warmest response from South Wales Police.
To be honest, though, just think of it, you were taking Alan Michael to court. That worked.
Well, you may very well say that. I couldn't possibly comment. Again, I do want to reiterate, I recognise that the police have a really difficult job to do, and there are plenty of very good and honourable police officers doing their job in difficult circumstances. And as it happens, in a former life as a Cardiff councillor, and when I was chair of the licensing committee, I worked with some of the officers who've been heavily involved in facial recognition, and they're not bad people. I just fundamentally disagree with them on matters around civil liberties. But it isn't something that I kind of relished in that sense. I don't want to. I'm not a combative person. I don't like having arguments. This was a matter of principle. I recognised that I was probably in a particularly good position to be able to bring this case, and it felt like the right thing to do. So in that sense, I've not minded doing it. Some of the brickbats that have been chucked my way on social media by people who feel very strongly the other way has been not something I particularly care to repeat, but again, I knew that was going to happen, and you kind of know that when you put your head above the parapet. So yeah.
Obviously, the decision of the High Court didn't go exactly your way. You won under some of the grounds, but not all of them.
So the initial hearing was held in Cardiff at the divisional court, and we lost that completely, which I think was a surprise because, normally on something like this, if you bring a case on 5 different grounds, then you think you might win on some and lose on others, and yeah, it's a kind of a mixed bag. So to lose on all initially was a surprise, and I think when we looked at the judgment, we felt there was some strong grounds for the appeal, which we brought, and that was held at the Court of Appeal over Skype in May, June. I lose track of time amidst everything that's going on. And then we had the result last week, and we won on, I think, 3 out of the 5 grounds that we won. Now, I will let those who are lawyers look through the judgment and speak more knowledgeably than me about what that means. But my lay reading of it is that one of the court's key findings was that, contrary to the arguments of South Wales Police and the Home Office, facial recognition technology is not analogous to taking photographs or the use of CCTV. And the court found that because this technology involves capturing images, automatically processing sensitive data, most of whom won't be of interest to the police, that it's far more intrusive than taking photographs or taking CCTV, and that because of that, there is not the necessary quality of law, to use the terms that the court used, for it to be used within existing legislation. And that really was one of the fundamental points that we made, is that clearly technology has evolved faster than the law can keep up with it. And, we felt that the legal architecture was not there for this to be used in accordance with current data protection legislation and other things. So that was the kind of first big win. Some of the other areas where we won were slightly more technical and slightly more to do with some of the guidelines and policies that South Wales Police were using or not using correctly, as the court found out. So one was around privacy impact assessments, which the court found were written in such a way that facial recognition could be used to find anyone who's of interest to the police, which the court felt left too broad a discretion vested in individual police officers to describe who should go on a watch list. So in essence, their policy around privacy impact was written too broadly, which I think is really important, because one of the points that we've made is that this shouldn't just be something that's a free pass to go and find absolutely anyone who might be of interest to the police. If you're going to use this technology, you need to have really clearly defined specific criteria that say who you're looking for. And then the final area, which is really important, and I suspect we'll want to talk about a bit more, was around the police's public sector equality duty. So, the duty on public bodies to do things in a way that don't undermine equality legislation. And the court found that South Wales Police had, and again, I'm going to quote it directly, South Wales Police had never sought to satisfy themselves that the software programme in this case does not have an unacceptable bias on the grounds of race or sex. And the reason that that's important is that we said in the case that the technology that South Wales Police are using is particularly bad at recognising black faces and female faces. And, this wasn't so much of a live issue at the start of the case, but it was around the time of the appeal that, amidst all the stuff around Black Lives Matter, amidst a period where the policing of black communities in particular is fraught with sensitivities, using a technology that could potentially add to tensions between black communities and police and lead to black citizens being disproportionately and wrongly challenged by the police. That's not just something that's an injustice in itself, but it entrenches unjust policing patterns. That's something that should really give the police pause for thought.
So just going back to the initial judgment, when that didn't go your way, was there any thought on your part that you wouldn't go any further, or were you always sure that you were going to proceed and appeal?
I think we always expected that it would go to at least kind of a second round and possibly even a third round, and I think that would have been likely whoever had won. I think even if we'd won on all 5 grounds in the divisional court, I think South Wales Police would have appealed it. I think it was always likely it would go to the next stage. When we saw the judgment of that first hearing, I think we felt, bluntly, and again, I defer to the lawyers on this. I think they felt that there was a lot that the 2 judges in the first hearing had got wrong. My understanding is that within the kind of legal community, I think there was an expectation that we would probably win some of the grounds that we brought for appeals. So in hindsight, it was the right thing to do. But I suspect if the result had gone the other way, South Wales Police would have appealed it as well.
So where, Ed, does that leave the police now? What's the outcome of the judgment in terms of what they're able to do? So didn't the Chief Constable of South Wales Police say something along the lines that the judgment was something they could work with?
Yeah, so they've said they're not going to appeal it, which again I think was a bit of a surprise. I think we thought it might go all the way to the Supreme Court. South Wales Police have said they won't appeal it. I think that, and again, this is probably from a position of slight naivety, but my kind of reading of that is that either they think that the Home Office will bring forward new legislation that specifically governs this, or that they can just update some of their policies, in relation to those latter 2 issues in particular, to take account of what the court has said. Now, we will see what that may mean in practice, and at some point I'll need to speak with Liberty to work out what the next stages might be for us. But I would imagine there has been a conversation between South Wales Police and the Home Office about how to react to this judgment, and if they are determined to keep using this technology, they will, I guess, look to find a way to do that. But we will be watching very closely to see what that means and whether that respects what the court has found.
I'm just thinking about other areas where this technology is used. It is used already in certain areas legally, isn't it? Is it something to do with passport control and things like that, or is it?
Yeah, so it is something that's fairly common, within airports, and anyone who's been to Bristol Airport recently, and possibly even Cardiff might have it now as well, is that you can queue up for what's meant to be accelerated passport control, although my experience is it tends to take twice as long. But you can also, interestingly, not queue up there and ask to be seen by a person. But again, they don't tend to advertise that particularly highly. So, I mean, from my point of view, I have slightly fewer concerns about it being used in those particularly defined environments. My issue is much more with when this is something that gets used on the high street or against protesters. That to me feels like the crossing of a line. And all of these are subjective judgments, I guess, to us as individuals as to what we feel is fine and what isn't. But it isn't something that I shriek with horror about when I see it being used in an airport. But when it's being used in everyday settings, I think to me that feels slightly different.
Yeah, I suppose that's what I mean. I think we've got that awareness of it is used in some places. And is that where you think the legislation might go, so that it'll define the context in which such technology can be used?
Yeah, I mean, I'm reluctant to start second guessing what may happen next, but that may be something that there needs to be much clearer guidance at the very least around who's being looked for, whether there is evidence to suggest they will be in a certain location at a certain time, rather than it just being a kind of stab in the dark type thing. All of these are possibilities, but one of the things we said throughout is it's not for us to try and come up with a set of guidelines, for South Wales Police, and whether they and the Home Office and the Met and others will try to develop something. I hope that they will have dialogue with civil liberties groups, but I don't know how it will shape out.
Certain private sector areas might want to use this technology in their own environment. So, for example, football, which is one of the things I've followed it mostly about, but by a condition of entry with a ticket is that you accept that you may be recorded in this way or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, there have been private organisations who have used it in certain spaces. So I think there was a shopping centre around King's Cross that had just imposed it in a kind of public square, but I think that was then scrapped that after kind of public outcry. All of this stuff, to me, it has to start with a proper engagement with the public and engagement with some of the concerns that are being raised. I don't know, if my football team started scanning everyone on their way into a ground, I'm not sure how comfortable I'd feel about that. But these are all subjective judgments that we have to make as individuals. For me, the reason for bringing this particular case is that the state has to lead by example in all this, and when it's the police using it, I think that they need to be held to a much higher level of, because you can make decisions about whether you go to a certain football match or whether you go to a certain shopping centre, but you can't make a decision about whether you walk down Queen Street on a Saturday afternoon. When this stuff is being used by the state, I think that feels different to me, and I think that the state should set the tone for what is acceptable and what isn't acceptable for how this sort of technology gets used.
So one of the things that came out of when you had your judgment last week was another legal opinion of the facial recognition trial they've had of the Met, and it was quite startling that even though yours was the first of its kind, it wasn't the sort of first legal opinion written on why this software is probably illegal and hard to justify. And you look at the Met figures, they proceeded with the trial even though it was something like 98% inaccurate, and it's really worrying. I'm just interested to see what your take on the Met trial was and the legal opinions that came of that after your case.
I won't pretend to be as across what's happening in London compared to South Wales. Liberty, I think, did sit in on a use of facial recognition by the Met, and some of the concerns that they had about that were lodged as part of our case. I think one of the more interesting things to me, it's less so about the Met, but one of the kind of legal interested parties in our case who made representations at both hearings was the Surveillance Camera Commissioner. So this is an independent regulator appointed by UK government. And I think initially the Surveillance Camera Commissioner was sort of, and again, this is only my non-lawyer reading of things, initially the Surveillance Camera Commissioner was broadly kind of supportive of the use of facial recognition technology, but within certain parameters. But actually, because of the way the ongoing use of this technology was being done, I think partly because of the relationship as well between the Commissioner and the UK government, and partly because of some of what was said in the hearings, the Commissioner was actually really critical of both the Home Office and the Secretary of State, and said that they'd been asleep on watch and should reflect on the comments of the court and act in the public interest in relation to this technology. And I think that's quite interesting. Clearly Liberty and I have quite entrenched views on one side, clearly South Wales Police on another. But when you see people like the Information Commissioner and the Surveillance Camera Commissioner expressing concerns about the way that this technology is being used, that to me suggests that there is something wrong here, and that there needs to be a much higher standard of how this technology gets used in the future.
You mentioned the issues that facial recognition technology has with on equality issues, how it struggles to identify and differentiate between people who are black. Do you think the police's continued use of this technology is indicative of their sort of problems with racism and systemic racism within the forces, or do you think that's not something they've considered, or what do you think?
Again, I think the best answer to that is actually in the judgment, and it's worth reading again because it's really stark. When it came to the police's public sector equality duty, the court said South Wales Police had, quote, never sought to satisfy themselves that the software program in this case does not have an unacceptable bias on the grounds of race or sex. Now, to me as a layperson, that suggests that there is a problem within South Wales Police that. And it may well be cock up rather than conspiracy, but this was not something that they had sought to address in how they use this technology. So I don't think I'd want to say more than that, because again, it's not something I pretend to be an expert on. I think at a time when sensitivities around this are clearly heightened and for good reason, addressing that has to be a priority for South Wales Police, and I have no doubt it will be, given the judgment.
So I can see a time when it'll come to, we talked about airports and it's being used. I can see it being rolled out in other mass transport areas, for the tube in London, for example. I can see that being publicly supported as well. But if we're not to use this technology, in the work you've done and what Liberty have done, is there any suggestion of other kind of technology the police can use to get the same kind of security they want?
I'm not sure I've got an answer for that.
No, I'm just wondering.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm always keen to not start talking about stuff that I really don't.
No, I think that's fair enough.
So, yeah.
One of the other things which you might not know about, but I am quite interested in, is we're at other parts of the world on this. At the moment, America's looking to de-police the state. But I imagine if we talk about this kind of technology, where it's utilised, I imagine America could be one of the main places it is. Is that right? Or
yeah, I mean, it is. I've already mentioned that on one extreme you've got China, in particular, Russia to a lesser extent, who are making extensive use of this, and the use of facial recognition technology to police some of the protests and uprising in Hong Kong have been quite worrying. At the other end of the spectrum, you've got some parts of the world. So San Francisco, I think, was one of the first areas that banned the use of the technology altogether, and there have been other parts of America, individual cities that have either put a moratorium on it or banned it outright. We also saw in the last few months, again around Black Lives Matter, IBM withdrew from the market, closely followed by Amazon, closely followed by Microsoft, all because of concerns about how police forces might be using the technology for racial profiling. So I suspect in many cases a lot of that is a pause rather than an outright stop. But I think, and again, there was quite an interesting piece of footage of an interview with a black man in America who had been wrongly profiled and arrested and briefly, I think, imprisoned as a result of facial recognition technology misidentifying him. So I think, all of that suggests that there are sufficient problems that this is something where, at the very least, there needs to be a kind of moratorium until we can be confident that it's being used in proper ways. And it comes back to what I said earlier. This is all about public confidence in policing, that if you have technology that's being used in ways that the public don't have confidence in, that's bad news for the police, actually, because it then makes it harder for them to do their job.
What would your take be on it if it wasn't used in the kind of law and order scenario? So what happens if it was rolled out a different biometric set where you're looking for raised temperatures or something like that for COVID-related issues?
I mean, again, there's been some really interesting stuff in recent months around the use of technology for COVID, whether that's like the test and trace stuff. There was the whole thing about which system the UK government would roll out and whether it be one that might store people's personal data or not. Yeah, I mean, all of that stuff, none of it comes without ethical implications and ethical considerations. And my interest in all of this, insofar as I have any knowledge at all around the way that tech gets developed, is to try to make sure that ethics is not something that just gets tagged on at the end. I think too often when there are interesting emerging technologies that have uses, whether that's around healthcare or policing, that we don't just go, great, let's roll out the technology, and then at the last minute some poor sod in HR is kind of given the job of, can you make sure that this is ethical? Actually it has to be front loaded and it needs to be part of how technology is developed. It's not just developed by software developers. It actually has to be something that involves ethical considerations and conversations with the public first to understand how people feel about giving up their data. It's one of the things that I said a lot right at the start of the case, because it was just after new GDPR legislation that it felt as though I had more rights over what ended up in my spam box than I did whether my local police force were filming me and capturing my data. And that does just feel wrong, I think, to a member of the public. So at a time when we're becoming ever more conscious of our personal data and the way that our data is mined by groups with their own kind of motivations and self-interest, like we should have a higher standard of what we expect organizations and particularly the state to do and handle that data.
No, totally agree. And I wanted to thank you for taking the case with Liberty, but that's kind of where my next question is, and probably my last question. What was it like, actually, not so much on the subject here, but what was it like being part of that whole process, taking ostensibly the state to court and actually winning?
it was at times exhilarating. So when we got the news, that was, one of those things where you think, well, whatever happens, like that's a real kind of legal milestone, and that vindicates the concerns that we had over it and vindicates our rationale for bringing the case, and that was great. There have been more challenging moments as well. So, like I say, I've had my fair share of kind of abuse on social media, and that was kind of priced in when I agreed to take the case. That I knew that would be coming my way, but I can't pretend that that's particularly enjoyable, and it's had its impact on just family life and stuff as well. Particularly in the last week when I've been doing interviews like this one rather than spending time with my kids, although actually having spent all day with them today, it's quite nice to have a break. But so yeah, it comes with a whole load of other things. But I feel more than ever now that it was the right thing to do. It's something I'm proud of doing, because we all get the odd opportunity in our life to stand up and do something that we believe in. And I think I don't know, I was brought up that if you think something's important, you should stick your head above the parapet and say so. So yeah, it's had its ups and downs, but I think on balance I'd probably do it again.
What do you hope to be the broader consequences of the case and the judgment, Ed?
So, clearly there are plenty of people, including Liberty, who want this technology banned altogether. And as I say, I kind of flip between that and a slightly more nuanced position. But I think at the very least, there needs to be a recognition that technology has developed faster than the law can keep up with it. I think there needs to be a proper public dialogue about where people feel the line should be drawn around, if this technology is to be used, what's a reasonable deployment of it, whether that means restricting watch lists to a certain kind of category and above of seriousness for what you're looking for, whether you say you only use it if you have evidence that person X will be in place Z at such and such a time or whatever. That, again, that feels like a reasonable restriction to put on it, and just not having a kind of ongoing blanket use. I mean, that feels like a good starting point to me as a layperson. Yeah, making sure that as the technology develops, that the law can keep up with it, and that there's a kind of ongoing dialogue, I suppose, between lawmakers and civil liberties groups, and that it's not just something that is imposed. I think there needs to be a recognition that there are two sides to the conversation.
Ed Bridges, thank you very much for coming on this evening. If people want to get in touch with you, what's the best way to do so?
If they want to be pleasant, then I'm on Twitter at Dr. Ed Bridges, DRED Bridges. And if they don't want to be pleasant, then they can just lean out a window and shout, and I'll hear it. Or not.
Well, thank you very much, Ed.
Cheers.
If you like what you've heard this evening, please find us on Medium at HiraethBlogCymru, on Facebook at HiraethBlogCymru, and on Twitter at HiraethBlog. Thank you for listening to Hiraeth. If you like what you heard, please don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review.